Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience, believe it or not. And today I want to talk about a topic that I found pretty fascinating over the past few years. What if people could drink but never have a hangover? Back in the days when I had the opportunity to talk to people all over the country and really all over the world, about neuroscience, one of the most frequent questions was, how do I not get a hangover? Water is the answer. C.S. Murphy, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And actually, that's kind of a misconception. Like, I know what you're talking about, where people will recommend have a glass of water between every beverage, between every beer, every, glass or whatever. And I mean, it helps. But it's not because it's not because ethanol is dehydrating, right? That was the sort of the explanation that people would give for how to prevent a hangover, like water helping. Really, the thought at this point is that just drinking that much water just slows you down, and that is like the main thing that causes hangovers is the speed at which alcohol is consumed. And we'll get into that a little bit because there's like a specific enzymatic reason for that. And one of the options that we're going to describe targets specifically that problem, that deficiency of alcohol. Hey, Christine. And so, Brad, big meal before drinking helps absorb. That is true. And so really a big fatty, like a meal with a lot of fat can help a lot, just because of how alcohol, like the ethanol molecule interacts with fat. It slows down the metabolism of ethanol, the absorption. So yeah, I mean, you're right. But we have some even cooler alternatives to talk about today. And so David accompanying this broadcast with a nice white port. Ooh, that sounds really nice. Yeah. Man, I haven't had like wine in quite a while, or I don't know, I guess port specifically. I definitely haven't had for quite a while, but yeah, some nice like prosecco would be really good right now, or a hot toddy because it's like surprisingly cold here in Philly, all of a sudden. But anyways, hey Rick from Vancouver, hello from Philadelphia. Okay, so there are very practical answers to the question of how to drink without getting a hangover, and we've already gotten into some of the classic ones, right? And perhaps we can get into some more specific tips towards the end. But today I wanted to explore an answer to that question that doesn't involve ways to enable somebody to consume large amounts of alcohol or ethanol without suffering the consequences the next day, and is actually a completely different approach that involves some solid neuropharmacology. Hey, Carrie, great to see you too. Thanks for hopping in. So, obviously there's like a whole variety of substances that people consume purely recreationally, right? Nicotine, caffeine, and increasingly legally in the United States, cannabis. But I think it's pretty uncontroversial to suggest that alcohol occupies a pretty singular role among mind-altering substances, certainly in the United States. But I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that this isn't exactly unique to the United States, right? And so when it comes to substances that, very, very potently alter our states of consciousness, it's kind of hard to think of another substance that's more widely accepted among such broad constellations of cultures. And, of course, not every culture welcomes the effects of alcohol. Where's our map? Here we are. So we're looking at a variety of different, types of restrictions on how alcohol can be consumed, if it can be consumed at all, with countries colored in blue completely prohibiting its consumption, green allowing for certain communities within those countries to consume alcohol, light green prohibiting its consumption in public areas, and yellow prohibiting its consumption in public areas between 10:30 p.m. and 7 a.m., which seems maybe unique just to Singapore. I'm not sure. But the countries that are filled with gray have no such restrictions. And so, of course, there are a whole variety of like general restrictions in these countries, right, based on things like legal age of purchase, where and when it's legal to consume alcohol. But I think it's safe to say that the majority of inhabited land by humans allows for the consumption of this particular substance. Thank you so much for the award, Kara. I appreciate it. Yeah, and alcohol with no hangover? Tell me more. Yeah, let's get into it. Okay. But first, a little bit of backstory here. So, of course, humans have a very long history with this substance, with evidence of brewing going back 13,000 years. So I'm most certainly not an archaeologist, but archaeologists have found evidence that humans were likely creating alcohol around 13,000 years ago. And you can see some of the evidence in this figure from the paper that described this find. And, I'm totally unprepared to like really scrutinize this paper. But I have a link to it if anybody would like to check it out. It's freely available. And so we're looking at the region of the world and the evidence of the tools that were used to brew specifically beer, right? Which is pretty wild if you think about it. 13,000 years. So not that it's particularly critical that humans have been altering their states of consciousness with this particular substance for thousands of years, But it is kind of interesting to contemplate that over 10 millennia ago, humans not only figured out how to produce this particular substance, right, but then came up with the whole production process to intentionally create it, theoretically to ingest it. And so, my scientific background is neuroscience, right? But to be completely honest, I'm a neuropharmacologist at heart. And so neuropharmacology is a subset of neuroscience that focuses on how various molecules interact with the brain and the effects that they have and how those interactions influence human cognition, consciousness, and health. And so, wow, a drinking curfew. Yeah, Carrie, yeah. And then David Howden says, in the UK, there can be areas designated where consumption outdoors is not allowed, but it's not general, where it's not allowed. Oh, it's so if there isn't a specific prohibition on public consumption, the assumption is that you can consume it in public. That's interesting. In the United States, it's kind of like the inverse, where there are certain places that expressly provide for public consumption. Like New Orleans is one of the most kind of infamous parts of the country where that's true. You can just like walk down the street with a beer or a hurricane or whatever. For a while during the pandemic, kind of interestingly, a lot of municipalities, Philadelphia included, temporarily made it legal to drink in public, which is like out in public. And if anybody's familiar with Philadelphia, Philly had some like weird, or had until very recently had some really weird alcohol-related policy, just because of the history of Quakers sort of establishing or running this part of the world of this country. And so as a result, there was just like some really weird prohibitions on like where you could get particularly hard alcohol and from whom. Right, it all had to be from the state, which is kind of interesting. But anyways, okay. And then sports for the blind. Hey, good to see you, Troy. It would be cool to see you on Joe Rogan. Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun. I know he fancies himself a bit of a connoisseur of some of the hard liquors. I think whiskey specifically he likes. But anyways, okay. So yeah, I'm a neuropharmacologist at heart. Okay. And so this is as opposed to like other subsets of neuroscience, right? Like cognitive neuroscience, electrophysiology, molecular biology, behavioral neuroscience, developmental neuroscience, and then there's a whole bunch of other ones. And, to be clear, it's not like the divisions between these subsets of neuroscience are like particularly rigid. So like my research required me to do a fair bit of behavioral neuroscience. I worked with electrophysiology and molecular biology. I made viruses that had specific effects that I needed to conduct my experiments, right? And that kind of dynamic is pretty common within neuroscience. It's rare that somebody just exclusively works within any one of those sort of subsets of neuroscience. And it's generally prudent to like swim in all those different neuroscience waters to be able to conduct more interesting experiments and answer more interesting questions. Okay, so James says, my town, now that is a very English word, or not English, I guess, maybe, I don't know, Gaelic, or I'm not sure. Way too many consonants in that word, but I'm going to give it a shot. Kirkintilloch. Is that right? If I'm right, I get, 10 points to Gryffindor for sure. Scottish. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So Scottish. So it's not, interesting. Cool. Was dry. So Kintilloch was dry temperance-wise from 1919 to 1972. Whoa, that's a really long time. And kind of shocking in that part of the world for there to have been an era of prohibition. Very interesting. Maybe that's more common than I would expect in the UK. Very interesting. And so, yeah, so I'm a neuropharmacologist, right? And by that, what I mean is like, it's the thing that really got me into the discipline. And it was this curiosity regarding, like how it is that various substances influence how people experience the world, right? And so initially, for me at least, it was caffeine. So, caffeine's easily, one of the other most widely consumed drugs in the world. It's actually the most consumed drug in the world. And I know that, many of those countries that prohibit alcohol are known for consuming prodigious amounts of caffeine. And I've seen that firsthand. But anyways, I found caffeine fascinating as a kid, right? Like I knew it was a stimulant, but I never really understood what that meant. Like, okay, it's a stimulant, but like, why? Why does this particular molecule stimulate people while something like broccoli or red meat or vitamins, why does caffeine in particular make people feel more energetic, whereas most other things don't? And so down that rabbit hole I went, right? Caffeine is a stimulant because it interacts with this specific receptor in the brain that normally binds a neurotransmitter, right? And neurotransmitters are just little molecules that carry signals between our neurons. Okay, but why is that stimulating, right? Well, because that receptor, the adenosine receptor, in the case of caffeine, happens to play a role in determining how tired we feel over the course of the day. The longer or the more that those receptors are bound, right, the more we feel tired. And that tends to happen more and more the longer that we're awake, right? Almost like a clock. That's why we get tired. Okay, but why is that stimulating? Well, the downstream consequence of that is that other neurotransmitters end up being released. Neurotransmitters like catecholamines, things like norepinephrine or dopamine, with which you might be familiar. And so those neurotransmitters are involved in making us more alert and aware of our surroundings. Okay, but why is it? And as you can see, right, there's like this infinite regression of questions to try and understand why it is that this one tiny little molecule not only makes people feel like they have more energy, but is also consumed by millions of people across the world on a daily basis, right? For me, that's like pretty magical, but when we turn our attention to the truly massive spectrum of molecules that alter our consciousness in almost innumerable ways, it was just like I discovered this entire field of science that, at least to me, was and kind of still is basically indistinguishable from sorcery. And so, I can make a molecule, and that molecule will change how someone experiences the world. That's wild. And so, but even beyond that, which I think is super cool, neuropharmacology is also one of the most reliable ways for us to understand human consciousness. And so hear me out. Come with me. It's story time. So one of the central tactics in science, including neuroscience, to understand how the brain works is by messing with it, right? You can change the way one part of the system is working by breaking it or by making it more or less active. And then you can see how the overall output in the rest of the brain changes. And so, how do we know that, how do we know what part of the brain enables us to see? Well, the predecessors to scientists hundreds of years ago, they recognized that when people had severe injuries to the backs of their heads, their vision would deteriorate, quite literally. I mean, that's how this knowledge was initially developed. And so Christine Taylor says, for caffeine, doesn't it speed your heart rate up more than anything? Well, it does do that. But that is a byproduct of its stimulating effects, right? It's just having an elevated heart rate wouldn't necessarily be stimulating, but generally speaking, your heart rate goes up when you're stimulated. But that's one of its many effects, but its most central effect, caffeine, is basically blocking that adenosine receptor that is typically bound by adenosine. And it's just like the longer you're awake, the more adenosine is binding those receptors. And so caffeine just gets in the way. Basically it's like you're covering the clock for the brain. So the brain has no idea how long you've been awake. Kind of works like that. But anyways, yeah, that's basically how neuroscientists, or let's say the predecessors to neuroscientists, initially recognized that the back of the brain is where vision is handled, because when somebody would have an injury specifically in that part of the brain, their vision would deteriorate. That's how we started learning about, the relationships between different parts of the brain and consciousness. But then later on, once medicine sort of graduated to being more than just kind of eminence-based, when they started integrating a little bit of actual evidence, surgeons would notice that if they stimulated very subtly, one specific part of the brain, the person would experience very specific changes in capabilities, in their feelings, in their emotions, and how they behave. And so a part of that whole trajectory of the maturation of science was understanding how it is that substances that humans had already been consuming for hundreds, if not thousands of years, how those substances interact with the brain. So why is that the opium poppy seem to ease people's pain and make them just kind of feel kind of good, right? Why is it that nicotine causes the effects that it causes, and so on, right? They're tools that enable us to get a better sense of how it is that the brain produces consciousness. And so for me, the discipline is not only the closest thing to sorcery, but neuropharmacology is also, devoted to interrogating the brain and consciousness on its own terms, right? Using molecules that interact with various parts of the brain in a way that's very similar to how the brain's own signaling systems operate. And so that's why I find this discipline so fascinating and useful and magical. But all of that said, it is a little baffling to me that alcohol, ethanol, right, to be specific, which is what we mean when we say alcohol, that alcohol would be the one, right, would be essentially the go-to substance for hundreds of millions, billions of people for purely recreational purposes. Or was it always purely recreational? So by the way, and this is probably just only captivating to me, but it's just kind of wild that this simple molecule, literally just 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen atom, is capable of inducing such a radical change in your state of consciousness. Isn't that just kind of wild? Look at these other molecules. Okay, so now we're seeing some pretty big molecules, right? You might recognize caffeine at the top. But this new one, and obviously I'm comparing sort of apples to like neutron stars here, but this new one is LSD, okay? And I don't know, it's just kind of fascinating to me that molecules of pretty radically differing complexity can all very effectively alter our states of consciousness, right? Obviously in very, very different ways. But LSD is a very significantly more potent molecule than ethanol, despite being this big old honkin' molecule compared to ethanol, right? It's just kind of neat to me that, tiny doses of LSD radically influence your state of consciousness, whereas massive, comparatively massive doses of ethanol alter your state of consciousness, despite being so different in complexity. Anyways, it's kind of just like an interesting tangent, at least to me. So for people in the United States, speaking to the prohibition or the temperance in Kirkintilloch, for folks in the United States, and maybe even folks outside of the U.S., there was a not so short period in the country's history when alcohol was banned or prohibited, and so in the United States called Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933. So it started around the same time as the town in Scotland, but didn't last nearly as long. But still kind of a long time, right? But at the time, Prohibition wasn't universally popular, particularly among medical practitioners who, at the time considered alcohol to be a part of their armamentarium, right? The set of tools that medical practitioners would use to address the various ailments and maladies, right? And so I just find this kind of a fun part of history. And so after a little bit of politicking, right, physicians recovered the ability to prescribe alcohol. And so that's what you're seeing here. This is a whiskey prescription. And I actually have a framed antique whiskey prescription in my office, just as a reminder of one specific thing that I think is simply true about the relationship that humans have with substances. If humans like to consume a substance, humans will find a way to consume that substance, regardless of its legal status, right? If you ban a substance that people enjoy, well, here's what's not going to happen. Everybody stops using this substance, right? There's just zero evidence of that ever happening in history. And so I just find it to be a helpful reminder, right, when thinking about the policies that might be applied to substances, right? Particularly relevant when we're contemplating cannabis regulations, right? And so James says, not totally sure on the 1972, might have been 1960s, but still a long time. Yeah, that's still really long. I mean, I'm kind of shocked at how long it lasted in the US, although it didn't last all that long, clearly. And then David Howden says, Churchill famously got himself an alcohol prescription for when he visited the US. Oh, I actually did not know that. But I know that FDR would, drink in the White House and stuff. And so, yeah. So, while alcohol had been portrayed as being medicinal at the time, when the force of the US government was devoted to preventing people, although, I mean, let's be honest, preventing normal people, right? Not the most affluent or well-connected. While it was portrayed as being medicinal when the government was prohibiting access to the substance, I think it's pretty clear that it's purely recreational at this point, right? Nobody's drinking alcohol as medicine. And so, because let's be honest, alcohol, ethanol, isn't a particularly healthy molecule to consume, right? And so without going too deeply into this topic, despite a very long time of biomedical science characterizing mild to moderate consumption of ethanol as being either largely benign, if not actually beneficial, the most recent high quality data indicate that there's basically zero amount of alcohol consumption that's benign, let alone healthy. And so in other words, this is just a substance that's intrinsically unhealthy, right? There's no healthy or beneficial reason to consume ethanol, but that doesn't mean that it's bad or that it shouldn't be consumed. And so just in the United States, which to be clear, consumes quite a bit of alcohol, of ethanol relative to the rest of the world, but not the most, definitely not the greatest alcohol consumption. And so, oh, wait, where is it? Huh. Oh no, there it is. Okay, great. So these are data from 2010, which is more than a decade old, which is kind of bananas to think about, but the trends are almost certainly basically the same. But even just in the United States, okay, the CDC stats for alcohol-related fatalities are kind of staggering. And so excessive alcohol use is responsible for over 95,000 fatalities every year in the US, which puts it above diabetes, which is about 88,000 per year. So that means 261 people in the US die from excessive alcohol use every day. And, and just to be clear, right, it's pretty difficult to pin down all of the alcohol influenced maladies, because we know that alcohol consumption is associated with things like cancer, liver disease, obviously, and then heart disease, which is the leading cause of fatalities in the US. But despite all of those stats, right, I submit to you, just because a substance is used recreationally doesn't mean that it's bad or it's pointless, or even that it shouldn't be consumed, right? But if there's an opportunity to address some of the shortcomings of this substance, of a substance that's people quite very clearly enjoy quite a bit, and will find a way to consume no matter what, right? If there's a way to improve on that substance, then I think it's a massive opportunity to improve public health in a way that isn't, completely incompatible with human behavior and predispositions, like by just prohibiting its consumption, right? And so that brings us to the specific effort or efforts to which I'd like to bring your attention. The effort to create an alternative to alcohol that isn't a frustrating compromise in terms of how pleasant alcohol can be. So in other words, what if we could come up with a beverage that tickles many of the same exact parts of the brain that alcohol or ethanol tickles, but is free from the toxic effects of ethanol on organ systems, and even free from the induction of a hangover? How cool would that be? And then August says, and LSD was once legal. Indeed, that's right. Christine Taylor says, it seems more of a money issue for the government to me that it was made legal again. I'm not so sure. I mean, the history of prohibition is really interesting, because the emergence of prohibition was very closely tied to the women's suffrage movement. Because understandably at the time, alcohol consumption had become such a problem in the US. I can't remember who did this documentary. It might have been Ken Burns, actually. But because there was a really serious drinking culture in the US, but that predated the spread of whiskey, of hard liquors. And so people would just drink kind of light beer, not even as strong as, current light beer, contemporary light beer, just sort of throughout the day. And, if you think about people who were colonizing essentially the US, they were pretty hard people, right? Life was not super comfortable back then. And so if you were, in, I don't know, wild parts of the country, the Wild West, taking the edge off on a regular basis probably made sense. But then miners, for example, would consistently drink, ciders and stuff like that, right? But evidently, once whiskey became so popular or so widely available in the US, people didn't change their drinking behaviors. And so they would just drink hard whiskey throughout the day. And so they would just get slaughtered. They would get hammered. And, of course, that was associated with a bunch of behavior that wasn't exactly gallant. And so, yeah, that they were sort of closely tied to one another, those two movements, which is very fascinating. But, the reality, and then, of course, prohibition, like it does with pretty much all drug prohibition, created this, massive black market, famously exploited by Al Capone. But yeah, I don't know. Of course, you're right that, a lot of tax revenues are derived from, sin taxes, essentially from alcohol. But I think it was more just people wanted to drink alcohol, and they were drinking alcohol, and it was more of a problem. It was causing more problems than it was solving. But I think you're absolutely right as well. And so, okay. So Betty says, I've had pot, but I did not inhale. Yeah, right. Yeah. How many of our most recent presidents have smoked pot? I think all of them, right? Maybe not Joe Biden, and maybe not Donald Trump. He's sort of famously, against most drug use. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? Definitely Barack Obama, definitely Bill Clinton, definitely George Bush, George W. Bush, maybe not George H.W. Bush. I could see him never inhaling. Anyways, yeah, it is kind of funny to think about, or maybe a little bit angering to think about, that it's still federally illegal. It's as illegal as a substance can be, cannabis. But at the state level, increasingly, it's not. Okay, so James Little says, it was a women's movement who promoted the Kirkintilloch temperance movement. Oh, is that right? Yeah, I mean, unsurprising, right? And for justifiable reasons, with just men coming home and just being totally hammered and abusive, and I can imagine let's just get rid of this stuff. But anyways, yeah, it's an interesting history. I think I did a podcast episode on specifically prohibition. It's just it's really fascinating. One of the things that I wanted to do for a really long time, if I ever had the opportunity to write a book, I would write a book about, one of the books that I would love to write would be a history of the United States, or a history of human evolution or human history, but maybe more narrowly focused, just so I could actually write this thing through the lens of pharmacology, right? Like going through the various stages. I mean, it probably wouldn't go that far. Although tobacco, hugely important part of the history of the United States. And obviously alcohol, as we were just talking about, but then also like hallucinogenic substances during a pretty pivotal time in the modern history of the U.S. I don't know. I think that would be like an interesting, like a biography of drugs in the United States. I think that would be just like an interesting way to explore so many different points, pivotal moments in U.S. history. But I mean, the same could be done for pretty much every country, right? Opium, for example. I think you could write a really interesting biography of opium. Anyways, if anybody has a publishing company, let me know where I can pitch. It was Clinton that said that. Yeah, it was definitely Clinton who said I did not inhale. Christopher Hitchens has a funny sort of little story about that's actually true that he didn't inhale, but that's because he hated smoke, former President Clinton, but he was a prodigious consumer of edibles. Now, who knows if that's true? I wouldn't put it past Hitch to fabricate a story like that. Okay, and then James Little says men drank all the wages on the Friday night after they got paid, evidently, right? Yeah. Oh, exactly, right? Yeah, just destroying, family finances and stuff like that. You should definitely write a book. I would love to. I would really love to. I would love to have like a, really big, specific single project. I think that'd be so much fun. Okay. So anyways, yeah. So the efforts that we're talking about are to come up with some alternative to just simple ethanol, right? Whether it's some combination of substances that interacts with many of the same receptors, or one that's even a little bit more fascinating, at least to me. So, that shouldn't be impossible, right? Like the majority of the effects of ethanol, or at least like the effects about which we care the most, right, are just a byproduct of ethanol's, the molecule, ability to interact with specific neurotransmitter receptors. And those neurotransmitter receptors, it's not like they're exclusively activated by ethanol. It's not like we have ethanol receptors, right? Other molecules can interact with them and do interact with them. And so, to be clear, like over the years, there have been substances that have been sort of described as being alternatives to alcohol in terms of like how they were used over the years, right? Things like GHB for a while and phenibut have been characterized by some as being potential alternatives, and that they have sort of comparable effects, but the reality is both of those substances have pretty distinct effects. GHB has some really interesting pharmacology. It has this really unique, or not completely unique, but fairly unique biphasic effects profile, where it's like it's sedating and then quite stimulating. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. But anyways, but those substances do have pretty distinct effects, as well as like a whole variety of their own biomedical ramifications in terms of like effects and consequences of use. Maybe a story for another day. But there's been an authentic effort to develop an alcohol alternative with a pretty renowned neuropharmacologist at the helm named Professor David Nutt. And so Professor Nutt is a scientist at Imperial College London. He's the director of the neuropsychopharmacology unit of the Division of Brain Sciences at Imperial College London, in fact. And for folks who are unfamiliar with that institution, it's one of the top research institutions in the world. And so in other words, like there are only very few humans in the world who occupy positions of expertise associated with neuropharmacology that are equivalent to Professor Nutt. And so synthahol seems good. Oh, I'm not familiar with synthahol. Let's see what the effects are, or these ingredients. So synthahol. That's fascinating to me. Synthahol, portmanteau of synthesized and alcohol, was a chemical variant of alcohol. It seemed to be very similar. Wait, is this a real substance, or is this like this is a fictional substance? Okay. Well, you know what? That is okay. So ethanol, blah blah blah. Yeah. Okay. So this is a fictional substance, but one of the things that we're going to talk about, might as well be called synthahol. Okay. So, but okay, back to David Nutt. So, Dr. Nutt is kind of a singular entity in the world of neuropharmacology, because like not only does he have quite a bit of scientific accomplishments under his belt, right? very senior scientist, but he's also played a very active role in at least trying to influence governmental policy associated with drugs, right? So he's advised the Ministry of Defense, the Department of Health, and the Home Office in the United Kingdom. Home Office is kind of sort of like the US Department of Homeland Security, kind of. But so in other words, he definitely does not shy away from bringing his expertise to the policymaking table, which I happen to admire quite a bit. And he may be completely unparalleled when it comes to science communication and outreach for someone with his level of seniority. And alcohol, which has been and continues to be a pretty substantial public health concern in the United Kingdom, has been sort of one of his bailiwicks. And so he's even pretty recently released a book on this topic. So here it is for anybody who might be interested in checking it out. And I am definitely planning on reading it when I can find some time. But all of that said, he's also a bit of a controversial figure in the United Kingdom. And so in 2007, Professor Nutt was the lead author on a study that was published in The Lancet, which is a very well-regarded biomedical journal. And so this is a paper that I'm absolutely planning to discuss in the future, because I think this is precisely the kind of role that neuroscience ought to play in informing policymaking when it comes to substances. Like, rather than just having an essentially capricious and very damaging and abusive, and expensive, although that's obviously not the most critical concern, rather than having what is basically a completely irrational system of laws applied to substance use, crazy idea, what if we base those regulations on actual biomedical evidence? I know, crazy. Thanks very much, Stanley. I appreciate it, man. Appreciate the award. Richard Roberts. Oh, thank you for subscribing, Richard Roberts. And then so David Howden says, your doctor here looks a bit like Scotty from Trek, who notably dislikes synthahol, preferring proper alcohol. Very interesting. And then Brad Hill says, alcohol being discovered so easily via fermented fruit and alcohol culture was just a matter of time. Yeah, indeed. I also find that aspect of like the anthropology of really all substance consumption, but alcohol definitely included, where like I just find it to be a fun kind of exercise to like just put yourself in the shoes of a human that would have been one of the first to consume alcohol, right? Or consume any substance, tobacco. Right? It's kind of hard to, or ayahuasca. That's one of the ones that like really, man, it took some real effort to like figure out how to consume, the right combination of things you could find in the forest or the jungle to actually generate some effects. I don't know. I find that very fascinating. But anyways, okay. So yeah. So Professor Nutt, singular entity pretty much in terms of really playing a very major role in at least trying to influence governmental policy and actually being effective and actually having good politics, like being good on the topic as opposed to just being an outright prohibitionist, which is the case with a lot of very senior scientists, where the initial assumption is it's bad. All of these substances are bad to consume, right? That's not Dr. Nutt's perspective. All right, I'll stop nerding out at you over the work he's done in the past. But so let's get into some of the work he's doing right now. And fundamentally, the goal here is to create an alternative to alcohol that doesn't cause all of the sort of negative side effects that alcohol causes, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. So fundamentally, Professor Nutt's effort is to remove ethanol from the equation completely. Okay, so trying to find some combination of substances that interact with some of the same targets, in the brain with which ethanol interacts, and then put it into a delivery system that's sort of comparable to ethanol delivery systems. Right, so here we go. Seems like there's a little bit of what's going on here? I wonder why. Okay, let's give it one more shot. Why is it not showing? Is it fill container? Yeah, I don't know what the deal is. Last try. Nope. It's frustrating. Oh well. Anyways, it's called Sentia, Sentia. It's an interesting looking bottle. I wish I could show you, gosh, because it is pretty cool looking. I think they did a good job making it look like whiskey. But frankly, as cool as it is, and as cool as it is that Professor Nutt is at the helm of this effort. When I look at the ingredients, I don't really see anything that suggests to me that this beverage would induce anything like ethanol, or at least not as nearly as potently. Like, it might have some effects, some really subtle effects, but definitely not nearly as potent or like severe. There it is. Okay. Maybe it's like a really big picture or something. Okay, who cares? That's what it looks like. So as you can see, it looks sort of like, maybe kind of like a newer style of like bourbon or something like that, right? And the concept behind this product, Sentia, is that the ingredients influence GABAergic signaling specifically. GABA being the nervous system principal inhibitory neurotransmitter, right, or off neurotransmitter. It makes it more difficult for neurons to fire action potentials or impulses. But I'm sure Professor Nutt is well aware of this, but GABA signaling is just one small part of the neuropharmacology of ethanol. Ethanol does a lot more than just interact with GABA receptors. I'm sure this is an interesting beverage, and I'd love to try it. Really, I would, to be honest. But I'm pretty sure that it's really very subtle compared to ethanol. However, there's an interesting different group, to address the ethanol molecule itself. Okay, and so and basically it's basically medicinal chemistry or neuropharmacology. And so the effort is by altering the ethanol molecule itself, replacing a hydrogen atom within the ethanol molecule, which is what you're seeing here, with a deuterium atom. Okay, so deuterium is basically like a heavier version of hydrogen. It's still hydrogen. It's just slightly different. It's slightly heavier, slightly bigger. And so by replacing a hydrogen atom within the ethanol molecule with a deuterium atom, it'll change the way that the ethanol molecule is processed by the body, okay? And so what it does is it changes the rate at which ethanol is converted to one molecule, and then that molecule normally is then converted to two other molecules when we drink it, right? And so what doing this, integrating some deuterium into the ethanol molecule, it slows down that conversion process. But that middle molecule, right? Ethanol is converted to a middle molecule, which is then converted to two other molecules. That middle molecule, the thing that ethanol becomes when it first hits our body, acetaldehyde is what it's called. That molecule is thought to be responsible for the majority of the like ferocious effects of ethanol. And so, basically after we drink alcohol, our bodies convert that ethanol into another molecule called acetaldehyde, which is then converted to two other molecules, acetic acid, vinegar, and acetyl coenzyme A. Right? Well, that middle molecule, acetaldehyde, is thought to be responsible for quite a large share of both the toxic and the unpleasant effects of drinking too much. And so convivial, the MAO inhibitor needed for DMT was a miracle to find. Exactly, Brad. Yeah, like finding just, what if we combine this, Mimosa hostilis root bark, which, why did they ever think to like put that into a tea? Who knows? Let's combine that with this other completely unrelated plant, Syrian rue or something like that, that also just happens to be an MAO inhibitor. Pretty impressive. Maybe the same comparison as weed to CBD. Oh, that's interesting. You mean in terms of like Sentia not being as like potent? Yeah, kind of. There's something to that. That's not a bad comparison. Although what we're talking about there is like similar but different pharmacologies, right? Like THC binds a cannabinoid receptor, CBD also binds a cannabinoid receptor, but generally speaking, they bind slight different cannabinoid receptors. Sentia is like, it's a combination of basically like things that could be sold as like supplements, I guess. Nothing illegal, and also like no like new crazy, very potent, research chemical or substance that has its own mind altering effects. Nothing novel, right? It's just a combination of things that they would argue elevate GABAergic signaling. And so, I mean, it's not a bad comparison in terms of like, THC has very, very potent mind-altering effects, whereas CBD not so much. Okay. Hey, Evan Almighty. Thanks for hopping in. Okay. So right, back to ethanol metabolism, right? We drink ethanol. Our bodies naturally convert it to acetaldehyde, which is then converted to acetic acid and acetyl coenzyme A, right? And in some communities, by the way, particularly communities with Asian heritage, they're less able to break down acetaldehyde, that middle molecule to which ethanol normally, is converted. And then that results in this community in a pretty rapid and unpleasant reaction, sometimes called Asian flush. All of that just because acetaldehyde is accumulating in the body. And so it's possible that integrating a heavy hydrogen, a deuterium atom, into the molecular structure of ethanol may pretty meaningfully influence the rate at which that problematic molecule acetaldehyde is produced, right? It might slow that down, which theoretically could be a molecule that would have very similar effects compared to normal ethanol, but I can only speculate as to how it might be different. Like one would imagine if doing so alters the interaction that ethanol has with the enzyme that converts it into acetaldehyde, one would imagine that, the ways that molecules interact with enzymes pretty similar to the way that neurotransmitters and drugs bind receptors. And so if it has an altered interaction with the enzyme, one would imagine it might have altered interactions with neurotransmitter receptors, but maybe not. It would be a very, very subtle change to the molecule. But regardless, the most interesting difference would be that it would be expected to be less unpleasant. It quite likely would induce lower hangover effects. And another reason, that this story caught my eye is that the person who's sort of pushing this effort to integrate deuterium into ethanol molecules is the founders of one of the biggest gene sequencing companies in the world, Illumina. And so, I'm willing to bet, given how massively successful that company is, and I imagine how personally wealthy he is, that this is the kind of thing that he's funded just as a sort of very distant afterthought, like, oh, I'll just sprinkle a couple tens of millions of dollars into this effort and we'll see if those flowers bloom. You know what I mean? And so, I imagine he has a bunch of those types of sort of like hobby efforts, but it's a fun thought, right? Modifying one of the most widely consumed molecules by humans in the world in a very subtle, creative way so that it's just a bit less toxic. It's kind of exciting. According to the founder, one of the co-founders of Illumina, the gene sequencing companies, according to him, as of September of this year, so just a couple months ago, they're interacting with multiple large beer, wine, and spirits companies who've expressed interest in working with the company if they can get approval for their deuterium alcohol. So pretty cool. So I'm imagining a future where we can enjoy the pharmacological effects of ethanol, the euphoric effects, the prosocial effects, probably one of the reasons it's so popular worldwide, the anxiolytic effects, the anxiety-reducing effects, where we just casually sit in each other's company and have conversations and enjoy each other's company, right? Okay, 1,000 points to Gryffindor to anyone who knows where this scene is from. But anyways, in all seriousness, it seems absolutely plausible to me that, we could either have some combination of substances like sentia or just a modified ethanol molecule with deuterium replacing some hydrogens that could plausibly replace one of the most widely consumed mind-altering substances in the world in human history, since, while that substance is responsible for some of the loveliest experiences that humans can have, it's also responsible for a very disproportionate share of human suffering. Okay, that's what I have prepped for you today. If you enjoy, exploring topics in biomedical science and neuroscience, consciousness, and so on, maybe you'll consider subscribing wherever you're watching, if you haven't, and liking and hitting all those buttons. Otherwise, I'll be here next week with a new topic, and thank you for watching. Okay, so Asian Road, Ian. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Hello, Edna. Thank you for joining, Edna B. So Stanley says, it seems to me that can ease some inhibitions. Indeed. Julie says lower hangover effects. Exactly. Right. So this would be like, it would be a technically different molecule, right? But it would be very, very similar, as opposed to like, when people say, back, I guess pretty much in the 90s, I think, or maybe the early aughts, GHB was sometimes consumed because you could just get this molecule over the counter. It was totally legal. People would consume it at bars, like recreationally. But like that, it has different effects, right? Even though it is inebriating and so on. But like just making a deuterized or a deuterium containing ethanol molecule, that would be ethanol still. I would love to try it. Like I would, in a second, I would be a guinea pig just because I would be so fascinated with, how different it might be. And then Stanley says, what the results are variable depending upon who you are. So that's true for most drugs. Betty LB says, check out the moonshiners when you write your pharmaceutical history in America. They use it for whatever ails you. Oh, yeah. Oh, you mean that is a very fascinating part of that history, isn't it? Yeah. Alumina, so yeah, all of those words are spelled wacky. So here, I'll just type it out in case you want to like check out these this company. So first of all, the gene sequencing company is Illumina. The Milk Bar, you got it. The Milk Bar in A Clockwork Orange. I can't remember if there was the milk that they were consuming did have some substance in it, right? If I remember correctly, because I read the book like easily over a decade ago, maybe almost 2 decades ago. Shut up. Okay. Yeah, the Miloco plus Milk Bar. Yeah, dude. Yeah, Clockwork Orange. Nice. For sure. So, and then my crassulus succulents are looking good. They are. Thank you very much. Yes, they are enjoying. They're enjoying all the sun that they've been getting in this new apartment. New for like the past over a year. But anyways, hello from Edinburgh. Hey, Helen. We were talking about Kirkintilloch in Scotland. That evidently was a dry town. Just I don't know. It was just surprising to me that would ever happen in Scotland. But very fascinating. For a long time, too. Mad Cow says, deuterium is up to 150 parts per million in drinking water. Does this mean drinking water can help with hangovers? Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, fair, reasonable to get there. But yeah, I mean, so heavy water is naturally occurring. It is far less common, or I should say heavy hydrogen is far less common than the sort of standard hydrogen, but it is naturally occurring. And yeah, you're exactly right. Like heavy water, which is, as opposed to ethanol being deuterized or having deuterium atoms, it's H2O, like some or both of the H's are heavy hydrogens. Does it mean no? So the hangover avoiding effects of the ethanol molecule having deuterium as opposed to hydrogen is that it just slows down the conversion, and all of our bodies do this, the conversion of ethanol to acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde, it's what's called a metabolite. It is what's thought to be responsible for the majority of both the toxic effects of ethanol on just organ systems in general, but then also the hangover, the pro-hangover effects of ethanol, right? And so the reason that people develop hangovers, so generally speaking, you won't develop a hangover if you drink just like one drink, right? And particularly if you're not like chugging the drink. Mild consumption, generally speaking, isn't associated with like a hangover. I mean, you'll still feel the effects the next day, but you're not going to have a pounding headache and that kind of thing, right? Generally speaking, it happens when people have a lot to drink. But there are basically 2 reasons for that. One is that just, at a certain point, that conversion of acetaldehyde. So you drink ethanol. Ethanol becomes acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is then also converted into 2 other molecules that don't have any hangover-inducing effects. Acetic acid, essentially just vinegar, and acetyl coenzyme A. It's actually used to make acetylcholine, believe it or not, kind of cool. Anyways, but those are 2 steps, right, that have to happen. So ethanol converted to acetaldehyde, that's 1 step, and those are physically like enzymes that are grabbing ethanol molecules and converting the acetaldehyde. And then there's another enzyme that's grabbing acetaldehyde molecules and converting them to those other 2. But so the rates that those enzymes can act are limited, right? They can only accommodate so much of both of those molecules, of both ethanol and acetaldehyde, right? And so if you overload with a bunch of ethanol, or let's say if you consume ethanol at like a kind of steady, rate, right? You're just having some sips, you're not like trying to get hammered. Then, yes, the ethanol will be converted to acetaldehyde, but this other, the second enzyme will be able to accommodate the elevation of acetaldehyde and convert them into those 2 other molecules that don't really cause hangovers, right? But if you drink a whole bunch of ethanol all at once, right, whether that's taking 2 shots, bam, right, or just drinking beer after beer after beer, then the amount of acetaldehyde that accumulates in the body will get to the point where you have a bunch of it left over because this enzyme is not capable of converting all of that acetaldehyde into those 2 other more harmless molecules. Right. And so, for example, and that's why I brought up the whole Asian flush reaction, and which is because for those folks who have, this specific form of a gene, they are less capable or incapable of converting acetaldehyde to those two other molecules. And so all you get is just a ton of acetaldehyde, which is then what causes the rather unpleasant reaction. And so the deuterium containing ethanol, the reason that it would theoretically reduce hangovers, if not eliminate them, is that it would slow down that conversion, that initial conversion of ethanol to acetaldehyde. Okay, and so you're basically just like able to consume more, and it just takes longer for all that acetaldehyde to start building up. And so this enzyme will be able to handle, the rate at which acetaldehyde is created. I know that was like a lot of like chemical terms, which can be a little bit distracting, but it is fairly simple, right? It's like, imagine that you have, a cup of water, and a cup of water, right? Or a faucet, let's say a bigger cup of water, a cup of water, and a cup of water. And you just start pouring like a fountain, right? You just start pouring, right? And there's like a little hole at the bottom of this middle cup. And as you pour, right, the water drains into this cup, and everything's fine. You're not splashing or anything, right? Just because that little hole is able to drain this cup as you're pouring it. Well, imagine if you you just like dump a whole bunch of water into this middle cup. That hole is incapable of draining fast enough, and so you get overflow. That's essentially what we're talking about with when people drink too much ethanol at once. And so you can get a hangover without drinking, 5, 6, 10, whatever, beverages, if you just drink, 2 beverages really, really fast, right? Because then what you're getting, that cup is overflowing. You're getting too much acetaldehyde. Okay, so it just slows down that process. That's why I think it's pretty brilliant. Okay, so gene sequencing company, exactly, yeah, that's Illumina. And then deuterium, right. And then Helen says, haha, because we're a bunch of raging alcoholics. Is it weird that I've not had a hangover? Well, no, I mean, Helen, so no, evidently, Kirk Kintilloch, and this is according to somebody else. So, I haven't vetted this, but why would this person lie, right? They had prohibition for like into the 60s, like well past when the US had prohibition. And I think the US and the UK actually have pretty comparable alcohol consumption rates. Here, actually, I have a map. Now it's kind of hard to see, of course, because, but yeah, I guess maybe it is a little bit heavier in the UK. This is 2010, so it might have changed. But no, I mean, the US is definitely known for consuming huge amounts of alcohol relative to other countries. Not the most, obviously, but yeah, no, this is definitely not like the stereotype of, people in the UK drink too much. Not at all. Anyway, so is it weird that I've not had a hangover? No, I mean, well, yeah, I suppose it is kind of weird for someone to never have had one. But yeah, I actually rarely get hangovers either, like very rarely. I have had one, or some in the past. But yeah, no, I really don't react to ethanol nearly with as much inebriation as some of my other friends. And it's not because I have a high tolerance or anything like that. It's just something I've noticed. And so I can be like pretty drunk, but not seem that I'm drunk, This can kind of be a problem, when I was in high school. But anyways, so that's what you call a drunk. And so Edna says generally. So Helen then says 1 drink, like a whole bottle of Jack, but not mixing with other booze. Yeah, you're just totally fine. Just drink 1 bottle of Jack Daniels. By the way, yeah, I am not a fan of Jack Daniels, which I know it's kind of like heresy coming from someone from the US. I think there are better bourbons. But anyways, or I guess Jack Daniels is not bourbon. Jack Daniels is whiskey, right? But yeah, I'm a fan of bourbon over whiskeys. It slows down the conversion rate. Yeah, exactly, Julia. Exactly. So moral of the day, pace yourself. Yeah, that is like the hangover cure, right? Is that, if you know you're going to drink a lot for whatever reason, right? You're like, whatever, at a sports event, tailgating or whatever. You're just having a party and you want to drink a lot. That's fine. The way to avoid, severe ramifications the next day is to just not drink super fast. It's to just, pace yourself. Exactly. You can have a whole bunch, but just don't drink it all at once. That's the secret. But then as other folks brought up, there are other things you can do, like eat a fatty meal. That helps to slow the absorption in actually a very, well, not quite the same way, because what that does is it basically sequesters ethanol. So you have a sort of like slow release effect. If you have a bunch of you eat a lot of bacon or French fries or fish and chips or something, fried food that have a lot of oil. is that you get this sort of like trickle release of ethanol from your gut, as opposed to just like bam, it hits the duodenum and then just is absorbed. But it is kind of similar to the deuterium containing ethanol in that you're basically just slowing down that it's basically all about limiting the amount of acetaldehyde that accumulates in the body. But may I have my second glass? Absolutely, please. Cheers. Brad Hill says Russia and its spirit drinking culture. Isn't that wild? Yeah. Like seriously, like singularly has a drinking culture. Yeah. I think I think vodka like literally means water or something like that. Kind of fascinating. I would love to go to Russia and experience that firsthand. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Anyways, yeah, I've been wanting to visit Moscow for a long time. So yeah, and then Brad says beer before liquor will make you sicker, liquor before beer, and you're in the clear. So there is something to that as well. But I think that there is this misunderstanding. Oh, okay. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this too when it comes to hangovers. So, not all liquors, all spirits, all beverages that have alcohol in it, they all pharmacologically are essentially identical. It's all about ethanol. And so like in terms of the effects, when people say like, oh, tequila makes me, whatever, sleepy, or it makes me aggressive, or whiskey makes me aggressive, I make mistakes when I drink Fireball or whatever, which I've actually never tried, but it sounds awful to me. But anyways, it is all ethanol. It like there's no neuropharmacological difference between these beverages, but there are differences in terms of what are called congeners, which are the other molecules within the beverage. So like wine, for example, has a lot of congeners, and those things can also exacerbate a hangover. And so, one may be more likely for, let's say, ounce for ounce of ethanol, right? Like 1 glass of wine compared to 1 shot glass of whiskey, right? It's about the same amount of ethanol, not really, but about. But the difference there is that, the wine has all of these other things present in the beverage, and some of those things can exacerbate the hangover. And by the way, what is a hangover? So a hangover, for the longest time, it was thought to just be dehydration, but now we know it's not that simple. It seems to be the byproduct of an immune reaction, an inflammatory reaction to acetaldehyde, right? And so it's like you have the flu, right? That's why you have a headache. That's why you have a whole variety of symptoms of a hangover. And it's not just like it's not like your liver hurts, right? It's this like general inflammatory reaction. And so yeah, some of those congeners in like wine and stuff like that can exacerbate that inflammatory reaction, which is kind of fascinating to me, at least. And so when you say beer before liquor will make you sicker, generally speaking, the best explanation that I could come up with for that is that liquor is more potent, right? Obviously, right? Just 1 shot glass or a beer glass full of whiskey is a huge problem, whereas a beer glass full of beer is like normal. But so if you're drinking beer and you're inebriated, right? You're already, your judgment is compromised a little bit, of course. But then if you but you can sort of moderate your rate of intake, right? My next glass of beer will bring me to this level of inebriation, and I know what to expect. So you're used to it, right? But then if you have some beer, right, and you're inebriated, and then you start drinking shots, then the doses that you're likely to consume are probably way higher than they would have been had you just started with liquor, right? And then maybe transition to beer, because you're just not going to be drinking like pounding beer after beer, whereas you can do that with shots, right? That's the best explanation that I have. It's not like there's some magical interaction between whiskey and beer, Okay, so Helen says, yeah, American whiskey, agree. I like bourbon. I'm not a big fan of scotch. I know, sacrilege, same with me. But to be fair, I've never tried like really good scotch, which I'm sure, just like a lot of things, is like probably really nice. I've only ever tried like Johnny Walker, and not like Johnny Walker Blue or whatever, green. I think the nicest one is Johnny Walker Black that I've ever had, it's like good, but I don't really love that peat taste. It's been a long time since I've tried it though, so maybe my flavor preferences have changed. I could imagine liking it now. There's only one way to find out, right? And then Helen says, yeah, I'm not a big fan of wine either. Give me the hard stuff. So David says, would anti-inflammatory drugs help? Yes, but there's a problem. So that is why, like, when you wake up with a hangover, the easiest thing, the most effective thing to do is to just take some anti-inflammatory medicine, right? But not if you're still drinking. Definitely not if you're still drinking, because non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, acetaminophen or other similar types of drugs like ibuprofen, naproxen sodium, like Aleve, right? All of those medications largely do very similar things. That they are different, but they do similar things in that they reduce that inflammatory signaling pathway. And so, yeah, your headache just goes away, and then okay, you feel at least that part of it is you feel much better. You still feel very nauseous, and that's a separate phenomenon. But yeah. So the problem with doing that, like I knew a kid who would in high school would pre-dose with acetaminophen with Tylenol before drinking, and makes sense. It's actually kind of smart on his behalf, right? You're preventing that problem from ever happening. The problem is that that's very, very unhealthy. that like alcohol is already pretty bad for the liver. The liver's a pretty resilient organ, but it's already pretty bad. It's not healthy for the liver. But so are those anti-inflammatory drugs. They demand the liver's resources. And when you combine them, it's like the effect is greater than the sum of its parts. It's like quite bad for the liver to consume both acetaminophen or ibuprofen or those types of medications with alcohol. So definitely don't do it while you're drinking. But then afterwards, once the alcohol is out of your system, then yeah, it's fine. Okay, will warmer wine be more potent than colder wine? No. It's an interesting. So it may have a more significant effect, right? Because of just how rapidly it would be absorbed, the ethanol, but it's still the same amount of ethanol, regardless of the temperature, right? So it's not more potent pharmacologically speaking. It's not like hitting the receptors more tightly or binding the receptors more tightly or anything like that. It's not like there's more ethanol in the beverage or anything. But I wouldn't be surprised if the temperature of the beverage affects how rapidly you absorb it, in which case more ethanol is getting to the brain at one time. And so it might feel more potent. And, for all intents and purposes, it is, because like you're feeling more ethanol at one time. But strictly scientifically speaking, no effect on actual pharmacological potency. That's an interesting topic. I've never thought about that. Yeah, nachos, cheese, a lot of fat and cheese, totally works. Yeah, it does make one wonder, like the types of foods that have sort of accumulated in pub culture or bar culture, like French fries and burgers and that kind of stuff. A lot of fat in those foods. And then Helen says, they say that that I'm brew is a miracle hangover cure. But I reckon a bacon roll and a cup of tea sounds more logical. I don't know what that is. I'm brew. Interesting. But anyways, I should head out. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for the awards. I really, really appreciate it. It's very generous of you. If you enjoy these kinds of conversations, maybe you'll consider subscribing if you haven't, wherever you're watching, and liking and doing all those kinds of things. Otherwise, I will be here next week.